On a quiet, rain-soaked morning in Portland, an unassuming diner became the center of an unexpected storm. Amelia Collins, a reserved veteran carrying a worn travel bag and years of silent memories, walked into Sunrise Diner looking for nothing more than a hot cup of coffee and a moment of peace. What she found instead was suspicion, judgment, and a confrontation that would shake everyone involved. A single decision fueled by fear and assumptions set off a chain of events that no one in the diner could have foreseen. Rachel, a young waitress, believed she was following protocol when she questioned Amelia. But in her rush to act, she uncovered truths not only about the veterans sitting before her, but about herself and the world she thought she understood. As tensions rise and the weight of unspoken stories begins to surface, the small diner becomes a reflection of something much larger: how easily we let fear cloud our judgment, and how difficult yet necessary it is to change. But can a mistake be the catalyst for understanding? Can kindness find its way back into hearts where prejudice once lingered? On a chilly morning in Portland, the city streets glistened with dew as the first rays of sunlight pushed through the gray clouds. Portland, though lively during the day, often held a stillness in the early hours, something Amelia Collins appreciated after years spent surrounded by chaos. She stepped off the bus and slung her worn travel bag over her shoulder. The leather was scuffed, its seams tired, but it held everything important to her. Amelia's life was not glamorous. At 64, she lived in a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The walls were bare save for a few framed pictures of fellow soldiers and family members who had long since passed. The radiator in her living room rattled in the winter, and the ceiling fan squeaked in the summer. The furniture was second-hand, but it was enough for Amelia. She spent most of her days alone, though solitude never bothered her much. After years in the military, serving in combat zones overseas, she had grown used to silence. Still, there were moments when the quiet turned oppressive, like a weight pressing against her chest. She had returned from service decades ago, but the world never felt quite the same. People she once knew had moved on, married, or scattered across the country. Amelia, with her steady yet guarded demeanor, found it hard to fit into civilian life. She had become the type of person people overlooked, a face blending into the crowd. Carrying her travel bag close, Amelia walked a few blocks toward a place she had read about in an old newspaper, a diner called Sunrise Diner. It was known for its friendly staff and hearty breakfasts, a place where regulars knew each other by name. Amelia wanted nothing more than a hot meal and a quiet corner to sip her coffee. After a long journey, she was ready to go home and rest. The diner came into view, a cozy establishment tucked between larger buildings. Its windows glowed warmly, and a small neon sign buzzed faintly above the door. Inside, Amelia could already hear the muffled sounds of conversation, clinking plates, and the hum of a coffee machine. For a brief moment, she hesitated. Standing on the steps of the diner, Amelia adjusted her bag and looked down at her reflection in the glass door. Her face, etched with lines of age and experience, stared back. Taking a breath, she pushed the door open. Inside, Sunrise Diner was everything Amelia had imagined: small tables neatly arranged, a long counter with chrome stools, and booths lining the windows. The air smelled of coffee, eggs, and something sweet, like fresh pancakes. A bell chimed softly above the door as Amelia entered, though few people noticed her. The morning crowd was already in full swing. A group of construction workers sat near the counter, laughing over their coffee. An elderly couple shared a stack of pancakes by the window. Across the room, a young woman in a hoodie tapped furiously at her laptop, sipping a latte. The hum of life surrounded Amelia, but she remained on the outskirts, quiet and unnoticed. Near the entrance, a young waitress wiped down a table. Her name tag reads, Rachel. She was in her early 20s, with dark hair tied back in a ponytail and faint circles under her eyes. Rachel glanced up from her work, her gaze landing on Amelia. For a brief moment, She froze. It was not Amelia herself that caught Rachel's attention. It was the bag. The leather was aged, with deep creases and scratches, and it looked heavier than it should be. Rachel's mind immediately raced back to an incident nearly a year earlier. A man had entered the diner with a similar bag, left it unattended, and caused a panic when something suspicious was found inside. Though the scare turned out to be minor, the memory had left Rachel shaken. Her stomach knotted as she watched Amelia approach a booth near the window. Rachel tightened her grip on the damp rag in her hands, her breathing quickening slightly. Amelia, unaware of the attention, settled into her seat with a faint groan of relief. She placed her bag beside her, its weight pressing against the booth cushion. The table was clean, the window letting in just enough light to make the space feel comfortable. Amelia picked up the menu and scanned it, her dark eyes calm but weary. Rachel hovered nearby, pretending to tidy a table. Her fingers nervously twisted the rag, her thoughts racing. Should she say something? Should she ask about the bag? A nagging voice in the back of her mind urged her to act. After all, her manager, Greg, had reminded the staff countless times to be vigilant. Rachel finally gathered the courage to approach. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and walked to Amelia's table. "Good morning," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can I get you something to drink?" Amelia looked up, her eyes meeting Rachel's. For a moment, Rachel was taken aback. Amelia's gaze was steady. There was something sharp and resilient about it, but not unkind. "Coffee, please," Amelia replied. Her voice was low and calm, with just a hint of exhaustion. "Of course," Rachel said, her smile faltering. She hesitated, her gaze flicking briefly to the bag resting on the seat. "Are you waiting for someone?" "No," Amelia answered simply, turning her attention back to the menu. Rachel bit her lip, her heart pounded as she searched for the right words. I hope you don't mind me asking," she began, her voice quiet. "But what's in your bag?" The question hung in the air like a heavy fog. Amelia's hand stilled on the menu. Slowly, she looked back up at Rachel, her brows knitting together slightly. "Why do you need to know?" Rachel's throat tightened. She could feel her manager's gaze from across the room. Greg, tall and sharp-eyed, stood behind the counter, watching the exchange with mild interest. Rachel knew she would have to explain herself if she let this moment pass. "I'm sorry," Rachel said quickly, her voice trembling. "But we've had incidents before. I just need to be sure everything's safe here for our customers." Amelia set the menu down, her expression unreadable. "Safe for whom?" she asked softly. Rachel flinched. "It is just a policy we follow," she mumbled. "I don't mean anything by it." Amelia studied her for a moment before speaking. "Do you ask everyone this question, or just people like me?" Rachel's cheeks flushed. "No, it's not like that," she insisted. "It's just that—" "I am sitting here quietly," Amelia interrupted, her voice firm but not harsh. "I ordered coffee, and I intend to order breakfast. If my bag is an issue, then you should ask to check everyone's bags. Otherwise, I suggest you let me be." Rachel felt as though the room had grown colder. She opened her mouth to speak again, but the words would not come. Greg, noticing the rising tension, gave her a pointed look from behind the counter, silently urging her to handle it. "Excuse me for a moment," Rachel stammered, retreating toward the kitchen. Amelia watched her leave, a wave of frustration tightening her chest. She picked up the menu again, though her hands shook slightly. It was not the first time someone had looked at her with suspicion, but it stung all the same. All she had wanted was a quiet meal. Rachel slipped behind the counter, her face pale. "Greg," she whispered urgently, "I think we should call someone. She is acting strange, and the bag—" Greg sighed, rubbing his temples. "Rachel, calm down. If she is not causing a scene, let it go. Do not jump to conclusions." Rachel glanced back at Amelia, still seated quietly by the window. Her heart thudded with unease. What if I'm wrong? She thought. But what if I'm not? The cafe's soft hum of activity continued around Amelia, though the weight of unseen eyes pressed against her. Outside, the gray clouds thickened, casting a shadow over the diner's windows. Amelia let out a slow breath, her shoulders heavy with the realization that peace, even here, was not so easily found. The hum of the diner continued, but for Amelia, the noise had taken on a different quality. Conversations seemed to soften, the clinking of plates dulled, and though she kept her eyes on the menu, she could feel its subtle stares, whispers behind napkins, the way people shifted slightly in their seats. She had seen this before. Years ago, after returning from her last deployment, Amelia experienced how quickly people made assumptions. Back then, strangers would whisper about the strange veteran with tired eyes, as though war had turned her into something foreign. Civilians could never fully understand the invisible weight soldiers carried, and Amelia never bothered to explain, why should she? But now, sitting in a simple booth in Sunrise Diner, that old weight returned. Rachel's nervousness had turned what should have been a quiet breakfast into something else entirely. Amelia closed the menu, carefully placing it beside her. The bag sat firmly on the seat next to her, its presence now an object of silent accusation. Behind the counter, Rachel wiped her damp palms against her apron. She glanced at Greg, who remained still, his tall frame leaning casually against the coffee machine as he monitored the room. Greg, always concerned with keeping the diner under control, made it clear his staff needed to act decisively if something felt off. "You need to trust your instincts, Rachel," he had told her once, after the last incident. "Better to look foolish than to ignore trouble when it's staring you in the face." Those words echoed in Rachel's mind as she struggled with her growing unease. The bag haunted her, its worn appearance, its heavy presence. What if I'm wrong? She kept asking herself, her pulse quickening. But another voice in her head whispered, what if I'm not? Gathering what courage she had, Rachel straightened her shoulders and walked back toward Amelia's table, her heart thudding in her chest. "Excuse me, ma'am," Rachel began, trying to keep her voice calm, though it wavered slightly. "I don't mean to offend you, but I need to make sure everything here is safe. It's just policy." Amelia's dark eyes lifted to meet Rachel's. Her gaze was steady, so steady, it unsettled the young waitress. "You have already said that," Amelia replied, her tone even but cool. "And I have already answered you." Rachel's throat tightened. She glanced around the room, feeling the weight of Greg's stare, her co-workers' silent confusion, and the whispers of nearby customers. She knew people were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. I need you to tell me what's in the bag," Rachel said, her voice softer this time. Amelia sighed, the sound heavy as though she were carrying far more than Rachel could see. Her fingers brushed over the bag, resting there for a moment before she looked back up. "Personal belongings," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Clothes, toiletries, nothing more." Rachel shifted on her feet, the tension in her chest not loosening. She wanted to believe Amelia, but her mind refused to settle. She thought of Greg's voice warning her, "You can't afford to ignore a gut feeling, Rachel." From behind the counter, Greg saw Rachel hesitate. Sensing that the situation was spiraling, he cleared his throat loudly. "Rachel!" he called, his voice steady but sharp. "Is there a problem here?" Amelia turned slightly in her seat, her gaze flicking toward Greg before returning to Rachel. Rachel froze, her face growing pale. She could feel Greg's expectations pressing against her like a weight. He wanted her to act now. "Greg," Rachel called back, her voice trembling but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I think we need to call someone, just to make sure." The room fell unnervingly quiet. Conversations trailed off, the sound of forks against plates stilled. Amelia sat motionless, her face composed, but her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "You think you need to call someone?" Amelia repeated slowly, her voice low and measured. Rachel's cheeks flushed. She suddenly wished the floor would swallow her whole, but Greg's sharp expression left her no room to back down. "I just want to be safe," Rachel murmured, trying to explain herself. "It's not personal, I swear." "Not personal," Amelia echoed softly. She studied Rachel for a long moment, and Rachel felt her chest tighten, as though Amelia could see right through her. Finally, Amelia let out a faint, tired sigh. "Then go ahead," she said. "Call whoever you need to." Greg didn't hesitate. He stepped away from the counter and toward the phone. "It's just a precaution," he said, though his voice lacked any true conviction. He glanced briefly at Amelia before dialing. Amelia turned her gaze to the window, watching as the gray clouds darkened. Outside, a thin drizzle had begun to mist the glass, tiny droplets running down like veins. The diner, once so warm and alive, now felt suffocating. Rachel stood nearby, her hands clutching the edges of her apron tightly, as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. She knew she should feel justified after all. She was only following what Greg had drilled into her head. But guilt gnawed at her anyway, a sick feeling twisting her stomach. Across the room, Jack, an older waiter who had worked at the diner for years, frowned as he watched the scene unfold. He saw the way Amelia sat so still, her composure unshaken, and he felt something in his gut that told him this wasn't right. Quietly, Jack approached Rachel and murmured, "You sure about this?" Rachel bit her lip and nodded, though she could not look Jack in the eye. "I just want to make sure," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Jack sighed, shaking his head faintly. "Sometimes wanting to be sure just makes things worse, kid," he muttered, before stepping back. The bell above the diner door chimed as 2 police officers entered, their uniforms damp from the drizzle outside. The taller of the two, Officer Reed, scanned the room with practiced calm before spotting Greg behind the counter. "We received a call about a concern?" Reed said, his voice professional but firm. Greg gestured toward Amelia's booth. "Right over there," he said, his tone clipped but steady. The officers approached Amelia's table, their boots thudding softly against the tile floor. Customers sat frozen in their seats, heads turning to watch as the officers stopped in front of Amelia. "Ma'am," Officer Reed said politely, "we were called here because of some concern about your bag." Amelia turned to face them slowly. Her dark eyes met Reed's without flinching. "I have done nothing wrong," she said calmly. "I am sitting here drinking coffee and waiting to order breakfast." "I understand," Reed replied, his voice softer now. He glanced down at the bag. "Would you mind showing us what is inside, just to clear up any concerns?" Amelia didn't move. She sat back slightly, the edge of her mouth curling in something that resembled a faint, bitter smile. "And if I say no?" Reed hesitated. "I'm just trying to resolve this quickly," he said. Amelia's gaze didn't waver. "If I show you my bag, will you check everyone else's bags in this diner? Or is it just me you suspect?" The room felt like it had shrunk. Reed opened his mouth to respond, but Amelia's words had caught him off guard. Around them, customers began exchanging glances, their whispers growing louder. Rachel could feel their eyes on her too, as if they were silently asking, "Why her?" Rachel's throat felt dry. She watched as Amelia finally reached for the bag. Slowly, Amelia lifted it from the seat, her hands steady despite the weight of the room pressing on her. "All right," Amelia said quietly, unzipping the bag, "if this is what it takes to put your minds at ease." The sound of the zipper slicing open was deafening in the heavy silence. Rachel held her breath, her eyes wide. She thought of Greg, of the incident a year ago, of the fear that had pushed her to act. Amelia reached into the bag and pulled out a wrapped object, carefully unfolding the cloth. What she revealed was not at all what Rachel expected. It was a picture frame, old, with scratches along its edges. Inside, the faded photograph showed a group of young soldiers in uniform. their faces bright with pride and purpose. At the center of the group stood Amelia, much younger but unmistakable, her arms slung around the shoulders of two comrades. The diner fell completely silent. Rachel stared at the photograph, her heart sinking as a wave of shame washed over her. "These are my friends," Amelia said softly, her voice steady, but tinged with something deeper, an emotion Rachel could not fully grasp. "We fought together. Most of them did not come back." For the first time, Rachel could not look at Amelia. The photograph sat on the table like a silent accusation, its presence more powerful than any words could have been. The diner remained frozen in silence. Amelia's steady hands carefully rested the picture frame on the table, her movements slow, deliberate, as though the photograph held more weight than anything else in her bag. For her, it did. It was not just a photograph. It was a piece of her history, a fragment of lives no one else remembered. Rachel stood beside the table, unable to look away from the photo. The young soldiers, some barely older than teenagers, stared back with a mix of determination and youth that war would eventually steal. Amelia stood at the center of it all, her expression proud, her eyes bright, surrounded by comrades who likely saw her as family. "This is what you needed to see," Amelia said quietly, her voice calm but carrying a depth of meaning that made Rachel's throat tighten. "Not weapons, not danger, just faces. Faces of people I lost, people I carry with me everywhere I go." Rachel's pulse pounded in her ears, the weight of Amelia's words pressing against her chest. She had wanted answers, and now she had them, but it felt like too much. The shame sat heavy, a knot twisting in her stomach. Rachel shifted her gaze to the photograph again, unable to speak. The rest of the diner had fallen unnervingly quiet. Customers who moments ago were eating their breakfasts or chatting over coffee now watched the scene unfold, their curiosity replaced with discomfort. Jack, standing near the counter, crossed his arms and shook his head faintly. He had worked in the diner long enough to recognize when things had gone too far. Greg, meanwhile, hovered behind the counter, his expression unreadable. He looked toward Amelia, his mouth slightly open as if searching for the right thing to say. But no words came. The photo, the faces in it seemed to catch everyone off guard, their unspoken judgment reflected back at them. Amelia reached out and gently ran her fingertips along the frame's edge. The gesture was so soft, so reverent, that it quieted even Rachel's thoughts. For a moment, Amelia seemed far away, lost in the memories that photo carried. Then she looked up, her sharp gaze finding Rachel again. "Do you know what it feels like to lose people you love?" Amelia asked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes searched Rachel's face as though trying to understand her. Rachel swallowed hard. "No," she whispered. "Then I will tell you what it feels like," Amelia continued, her tone low but clear. "It feels like carrying 1,000 bricks on your shoulders every single day. It feels like seeing their faces in your dreams and waking up to realize they are gone. You carry that loss everywhere you go, and the world keeps turning as though it never happened." "I carry them here," she said, tapping the edge of the photo. "And I carry them here," she finished, her hand resting over her heart. Rachel's eyes burned, and she blinked hard to keep her emotions in check. She could feel the stares of her co-workers and customers, but she no longer cared. For the first time, she saw Amelia not as a stranger with a suspicious bag, but as a person with a story, with memories, with pain she could not begin to comprehend. I'm sorry," Rachel whispered. Her voice cracked slightly, but it was all she could manage. Amelia's expression softened, but just barely. "You do not need to say sorry to me," she said quietly. "But you should ask yourself why you thought I was a threat in the first place." Rachel looked down at her apron, gripping its edges tightly. She did not have an answer, not one she was proud of. One of the police officers, Officer Reed, cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. He glanced at the photograph, his face softening slightly as he turned back to Amelia. "I think we can see there's no issue here, ma'am," he said, his tone apologetic. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding." Amelia nodded faintly, saying nothing. She carefully rewrapped the picture frame in the cloth, her hands steady once again. The officers exchanged glances, quietly deciding there was nothing more to be done. Reed turned to Greg. "Make sure this does not happen again," he said firmly. Greg nodded, though he said nothing in return. He looked uncomfortable, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The officers turned and left, the sound of the diner door chiming as they exited. Slowly, the hum of conversation began to return, though it was quieter, more subdued. Customers avoided looking directly at Amelia, but their voices held a note of guilt, as though they had been complicit in what had just happened. Rachel, still standing by the table, took a shaky breath. She felt her cheeks flush as embarrassment and shame mingled inside her. "Is there anything I can get you?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Amelia looked at her for a moment before shaking her head. "No, thank you. I've lost my appetite." The words hit Rachel like a punch to the stomach. She wanted to say something, anything, to fix what she had done, but no words felt right. After a moment, she stepped back and returned to the counter, her shoulders slumped. Jack caught her eye as she approached, his expression disapproving, but not unkind. "You crossed a line, kid," he said quietly. Rachel nodded, her throat tight. "I know." She turned to Greg, expecting him to say something, perhaps to reprimand her or to tell her she had done the right thing. Instead, Greg's gaze was cold and detached. "Get back to work," he said simply, turning his attention to the cash register. Rachel's stomach churned as she moved toward the kitchen. Her mind replayed the scene over and over, the way Amelia had looked at her, the way the photo had silenced the room, the way the officers had apologized while she had stood there, paralyzed. Amelia, meanwhile, remained seated in her booth, her bag now resting on her lap. She looked out the window, watching the rain streak across the glass. The diner's atmosphere was returning to normal, but it no longer felt warm to her. After a moment, she sighed and stood, slipping the bag carefully over her shoulder. She walked toward the door, her movements slow but steady, her head held high despite the weight of what had just transpired. The bell above the door chimed as she exited into the rain. A chill breeze blew against her face, but Amelia welcomed it. Outside, the world felt quieter, more honest somehow. She paused on the sidewalk, glancing back at the diner through the window. Inside, she could see Rachel wiping down the counter, her shoulders hunched as though the air inside the diner weighed heavier on her than it had before. Amelia turned away, her shoes clicking softly against the wet pavement as she began walking down the street. For Rachel, the morning dragged on painfully. The diner returned to its usual rhythm, but she felt different. She could not forget Amelia's face or her words, and no matter how many tables she wiped or customers she served, the weight of her guilt would not lift. When her shift ended, Rachel pulled her coat tightly around her shoulders and stepped out into the rain. She stood outside the diner for a moment, staring down the empty street where Amelia had disappeared hours earlier. Rachel's heart ached with a mix of regret and something she could not yet name. She knew one thing for certain: she could not leave it like this. Rachel walked home that evening with her thoughts tangled and heavy. The streets of Portland were damp and quiet, the rain now a light drizzle that tapped softly against her hood. Her coat did little to keep out the chill, but she hardly noticed. Amelia's words echoed in her mind like whispers she could not escape. "You should ask yourself why you thought I was a threat in the first place." Rachel had always considered herself a good person, kind, polite, hard-working. She treated customers well, got along with her co-workers, and always tried to do her job the right way. Yet today, she had felt something crack inside her, something uncomfortable and raw. When she looked at Amelia, She had not seen a woman tired from travel, just wanting breakfast. She had seen the bag, the quiet demeanor, and let her assumptions guide her. Why did I do that? Rachel wondered as she trudged up the worn steps to her apartment building. She lived alone in a small unit, the kind with thin walls and a single window that overlooked a parking lot. Inside, everything felt a little too quiet. She tossed her bag onto the couch and kicked off her shoes, the events of the day weighing on her. Rachel sat down at her small dining table, staring blankly at the scratches in the wood. She tried to justify herself. Greg had always told her to be alert, to watch for anything out of place. Hadn't she just been doing what she was told? But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself, guilt sat in her chest like a stone. She lost people, Rachel murmured aloud, remembering the photo Amelia had shown. The faces in that photograph were still so clear in her mind. Amelia had carried that picture, those memories so carefully, and Rachel had made her feel unwelcome. She let her head drop into her hands. The next morning, Rachel arrived at Sunrise Diner feeling restless and anxious. The rain had passed, leaving behind wet sidewalks and the smell of damp earth in the air. Inside, the diner was just as it had been the day before, customers chatting, Jack pouring coffee, Greg giving instructions behind the counter. Everything looked normal, but Rachel felt different. She slipped behind the counter, tying her apron, as Jack looked over at her. "Morning, kid," he said, his tone gruff, but not unkind. "You look like you didn't sleep much." Rachel forced a smile. "I didn't." Jack studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. He was a man of few words, but his eyes often said more than he let on. "Sometimes you gotta carry what you did for a while," he said quietly, refilling a coffee pot. "But you also gotta figure out how to fix it." Rachel paused, his words catching her off guard. Jack rarely gave advice, and when he did, it usually came when you least expected it. "I don't know how," Rachel admitted. "I mean, I really messed up." Jack shrugged. "We all do." He set the coffee pot on the warmer. "The question is what you're gonna do about it." Before Rachel could respond, the bell above the door chimed. She glanced up instinctively, half expecting to see Amelia again, her calm gaze and worn bag. Instead, it was a group of regulars construction workers who greeted Jack with a wave as they took their usual seats. Rachel let out a small breath, her chest still tight. As the morning rush began, Rachel tried to focus on her work, but the guilt stayed with her. Every time she passed a table, she thought about Amelia. She remembered the way the room had gone silent when Amelia opened her bag and showed that picture. Rachel realized she had been so sure she was protecting people, but all she had done was make someone feel small, someone who deserved far better. By noon, the diner had quieted. Jack took his break out back, leaving Rachel to work the counter alone. She leaned against the sink, rubbing at her tired eyes when Greg approached. "Rachel," Greg said, his voice flat as always, "I need to talk to you." Rachel stiffened. "About yesterday?" Greg nodded, his face carefully neutral. "Listen, I know things got complicated," he said, folding his arms. "You did what you thought was right, but we need to be more careful going forward. Customers are already talking. We can't afford another scene like that." Rachel frowned, the knot in her stomach tightening. "So, what do we do? Just pretend it didn't happen?" Greg gave her a sharp look. "I'm not saying that. I'm saying we need to move on. You need to focus on your job and let this go." Rachel felt her chest tighten with frustration. "But I was wrong," she blurted out, surprising even herself. "What I did to her, it wasn't okay." Greg's expression hardened. "Rachel, you were doing your job. You don't need to feel guilty about it." "But I do feel guilty," Rachel shot back, her voice trembling. "She wasn't a threat. She wasn't doing anything wrong. I made her feel like she didn't belong here, and I can't just ignore that." Greg sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Look, Rachel, I don't have time for this. Just focus on your work. I'll handle everything else." He turned and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving Rachel standing at the counter, her hands shaking slightly. She felt as though the walls of the diner were closing in around her, suffocating her with the weight of what had happened. That evening, after her shift ended, Rachel sat on a bench at the bus stop, her bag clutched tightly in her lap. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the pavement. Cars rolled by, their headlights flickering on one by one. She thought about Amelia again, her quiet strength, her disappointment, the way she had carefully placed that photograph back in her bag. Rachel wondered where Amelia was now. She wondered if Amelia was still carrying that weight alone. Finally, Rachel decided. She pulled her phone out of her bag and began searching. It took some time, but eventually, she found what she was looking for, a local veteran support group just a few miles away. She scribbled the address down on the back of a receipt and stuffed it into her pocket. The next day, Rachel arrived at the group's small office building. It was a modest place with a faded sign that read, Portland Veterans Resource Center. She felt her pulse quicken as she stepped inside, unsure of what to expect. At the front desk sat a woman in her 40s, with warm eyes and a friendly smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. Rachel swallowed nervously. I'm looking for someone," she said. "Her name is Amelia Collins. I don't know if she comes here, but I need to talk to her." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "Amelia does visit us sometimes. She's part of our community here. Would you like me to leave a message for her?" Rachel hesitated. "Actually, can I write her a letter?" The woman handed Rachel a sheet of paper and a pen. Rachel sat down at a small table in the corner of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she began to write. "Dear Ms. Collins, I owe you an apology. Yesterday, I assumed about you that I had no right to make. I let fear and ignorance cloud my judgment, and I treated you unfairly. You deserved respect and kindness, and I failed to give you that. I'm so sorry. You showed me a photograph of people you loved, people you lost. I saw how much it meant to you, and I still acted like you were someone you're not. That was wrong, and I'm ashamed of it. I hope you can forgive me, but even if you don't, I want you to know that you've changed me. I promise to do better, not just at work, but as a person. Thank you for opening my eyes. Sincerely, Rachel Bennett." Rachel folded the letter carefully, her heart pounding as she handed it to the woman at the desk. "I'll make sure Amelia gets this," the woman promised with a kind smile. As Rachel stepped back outside, the afternoon air felt warmer somehow. For the first time since the incident, she felt as though she had done something right, not enough to fix the past, but enough to start making amends. She hoped Amelia would read her words and know they were sincere. And as Rachel walked back toward the bus stop, the sunlight breaking through the clouds, she realized that sometimes change began with admitting you were wrong. Amelia sat in her small living room, the familiar hum of her old refrigerator breaking the silence. Her apartment, though sparsely furnished, was a haven of peace she rarely found anywhere else. The worn armchair near the window held her steady as she watched the world move outside. Sunlight streamed in weakly through the dusty blinds, catching on the picture frame she had placed on the side table earlier that morning. Beside her sat her travel bag, empty now, save for a few essentials. It had been a difficult night, her thoughts circling back to the diner, the accusing stares, the quiet humiliation. It was not the first time something like this had happened, but each time it did, it opened the same old wounds she thought had closed. She reached for the photo frame, running her fingers along the edges, as if it could bring her back to the time before everything changed. The faces in the picture, young, strong, proud, were still so vivid to her, even decades later. She whispered their names softly, her voice carrying a faint tremble. Tommy, Harris, Jennings, Sarge. They were gone, and yet they lived with her every day. In her quiet moments, Amelia wondered why she had made it home when so many of them had not. Sometimes, it felt like she carried all of their unfinished lives on her back. A sudden knock at the door startled her, breaking the stillness. She frowned, her instincts sharp even now. Few people ever visited her, and when they did, it was usually the maintenance man or someone selling magazines. She stood, her knees aching faintly, and moved to the door. When she opened it, her expression faltered for just a moment. Standing on the small welcome mat, clutching an envelope in her hand, was the waitress Rachel. Her face was pale, her shoulders slightly hunched, as though she were bracing for rejection. Amelia's gaze sharpened, but her voice remained calm. "What are you doing here?" Rachel swallowed hard. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say the entire bus ride over, but now, standing in front of Amelia, she found herself tongue-tied. I wrote you a letter," she stammered, holding it out. "I didn't think you'd want to see me, but I—" Amelia studied her for a moment, then reached out and took the envelope. The edges were slightly crumpled, as though Rachel had been holding it tightly for some time. Amelia glanced at it, then back at Rachel. "Do you want to come in?" Rachel blinked, clearly surprised. "Oh, if it's okay." Amelia stepped back, leaving the door open. Rachel hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. The apartment was quiet, the air thick with the smell of coffee and something faintly floral lavender maybe. The space was tidy but lived in, and Rachel noticed the picture frame on the side table immediately. "Sit," Amelia said simply, gesturing to the worn sofa. Rachel sat down carefully, perching on the edge as though afraid she might break something. Amelia lowered herself back into the armchair across from her and took a long look at the young woman sitting nervously before her. "You came all this way," Amelia said. "Why?" Rachel's hands twisted together in her lap. She hesitated, then finally said, "Because I needed to." She looked up, meeting Amelia's gaze for the first time. "I'm so sorry for what I did, for how I made you feel. I was wrong." Amelia said nothing at first. She let Rachel's words settle into the silence. Then she reached for the envelope, turning it over in her hands before opening it carefully. She unfolded the letter and began to read. Rachel sat frozen, watching Amelia's face for any sign of emotion, but her expression remained unreadable. When Amelia finished, she placed the letter on the small table beside her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Rachel's heart thudded in her chest. Finally, Amelia spoke. "You're young," she said quietly, though there was no cruelty in her tone. "Young people make mistakes. The problem is when you do not learn from them." Rachel nodded quickly. "I am learning," she insisted. "You don't have to believe me, but that day at the diner, I saw you as something you're not. I let fear take over, and I didn't stop to think. I know that's no excuse, but I want to change." Amelia leaned back in her chair, her sharp gaze softening slightly as she regarded the young woman. "Why?" she asked simply. Rachel blinked. "Why what?" "Why do you want to change?" Amelia pressed. "Because your manager told you to? Because people stared at you? Or because you see yourself for who you were in that moment, and you do not like it?" Rachel flinched at the question, but she did not look away. "Because I see myself," she admitted softly, "and I didn't like what I saw." Amelia studied her a moment longer, then let out a faint sigh. "You know," she said, "I have met many people like you, people who are afraid of what they do not understand. I do not hold it against you. Fear is easy. It takes courage to admit you were wrong." Rachel nodded, her voice faint. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that." Amelia's gaze drifted to the photograph on the table, her fingers tapping lightly against the chair's armrest. "Do you know what kept me going during the hardest times?" she asked. Rachel shook her head. "Kindness," Amelia said softly. "A stranger handing me water in the desert. A medic patching my wounds when I thought I would not make it. Small things that felt so much bigger when everything else was falling apart. Sometimes, kindness comes from where you least expect it. And sometimes," she added, her voice steady, It changes you. Rachel's eyes stung as she listened. The weight of what Amelia was saying settled deep in her chest, so heavy it was hard to breathe. Amelia's expression softened. You are not a bad person, Rachel, but now you know better. So the question is, what will you do with that? Rachel nodded slowly, understanding what Amelia meant. I'll do better, she promised, her voice steady. Not just for you, but for everyone. For myself, too. Amelia held her gaze for a moment, as though weighing the sincerity in her words. Finally, she gave the faintest hint of a nod. Good, Amelia said quietly. That is all any of us can do. Rachel let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her like a wave. She stood up slowly, unsure if there was anything else to say. Thank you, she whispered. Amelia watched her for a moment, then said, It takes courage to face yourself, Rachel. Remember that. Rachel managed a small smile, though her heart still ached. I will, she said softly. As Rachel turned to leave, she paused at the door and looked back. Do you think you'll ever come back to the diner? Amelia tilted her head slightly, as though considering the question. Maybe, she replied, her tone thoughtful. When I feel ready. Rachel nodded and slipped out the door, stepping into the late afternoon sunlight. As she walked back toward the bus stop, her heart felt lighter. Amelia's words stayed with her, lingering like echoes, gentle but unshakable. Sometimes kindness comes from where you least expect it, and sometimes it changes you. The days following Rachel's visit to Amelia were quieter, but not in the peaceful way she had hoped. Inside Sunrise Diner, the usual chatter and warmth felt forced, as though something invisible had shifted. Customers still came and went, their plates filled with the same steaming coffee, eggs, and toast. But Rachel noticed their sideways glances and hushed conversations. The incident with Amelia had left ripples not just in Rachel's heart, but in the very atmosphere of the cafe. People had seen what happened. Some spoke about it openly, saying things like, it was a misunderstanding. Others muttered about how unfairly Amelia had been treated. Rachel heard it all. Greg, however, pretended as though nothing had happened. If he noticed the difference in how people treated the diner or Rachel, he did not let on. For him, avoiding the fallout seemed the simplest solution. You're here to work, not to worry about things you can't fix, he told Rachel one afternoon, as she scrubbed down the counter harder than necessary. Keep your head down. It'll blow over. Rachel stared at him, the words rattling in her head. It'll blow over. How could something like that just blow over? She saw Amelia's face every time she looked out the diner window. She remembered how the room had fallen silent, how the truth of Amelia's story of her life had shamed everyone into stillness. But Greg would not talk about it, and most of the staff, following his lead, pretended nothing had changed. Only Jack seemed to feel the same weight Rachel carried. He would often catch her eye during shifts, as if silently asking, You okay, kid? Rachel appreciated the unspoken support, though she did not know what to do with it. On a Thursday morning, just as the cafe was settling into its usual routine, the bell above the door chimed. Rachel looked up, her heart leaping into her throat when she saw who it was. Colonel Daniel Brooks. The man who had defended Amelia that day now stood in the entrance, his tall frame filling the doorway. He was dressed in casual clothes, a thick coat and sturdy boots, but there was no mistaking the authority in his posture. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his sharp gaze swept the diner with quiet command. A murmur passed through the room as regulars recognized him. Rachel could feel their curiosity rising, the weight of their glances pressing down on her as Daniel walked toward the counter. Morning, he said, his voice deep but calm as he looked at Rachel. Good morning, sir, Rachel replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Is Greg here? Daniel asked, his tone polite but firm. Rachel hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where Greg had disappeared moments earlier. Yes, I'll get him for you, she said quickly, turning on her heel. In the kitchen, Greg was barking instructions to the cook about a late order when Rachel stepped in. "Greg," she said, her voice urgent, "there's someone here to see you." Greg frowned, wiping his hands on a towel. "Who?" "Colonel Brooks," Rachel replied. Greg froze for a beat, his expression tightening before he masked it with his usual detached calm. "What does he want?" Rachel swallowed hard. "I think he wants to talk about the other day." Greg's jaw tensed, but he simply nodded. "I'll handle it," he said sharply, pushing past her to the front of the diner. When Greg emerged, Daniel was standing at the counter, his hands resting on the polished surface. Greg forced a polite smile as he approached. "Colonel Brooks," he said smoothly, extending his hand. "Good to see you again. What can I do for you?" Daniel did not shake his hand. "I'm not here to exchange pleasantries, Greg," he replied evenly, his gaze sharp. "I want to talk about what happened to Amelia Collins." Greg's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. "I understand your concern, Colonel, and let me assure you—" "Do not insult me by brushing this off," Daniel interrupted, his voice still calm, but now edged with steel. The diner had grown quieter. Customers watched with barely disguised interest. Jack, standing near the coffee machine, set down a cup and straightened his posture. Greg glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," he suggested. Daniel shook his head. "No, I think this is something everyone should hear." Rachel froze behind the counter, her stomach twisting. Greg's expression darkened, but he said nothing. "You humiliated a woman who served this country with more courage and sacrifice than most people could imagine," Daniel continued, his voice steady but cutting. "You treated her like she was a threat, not because of anything she did, but because of assumptions you made. And you, Greg, you allowed it. You encouraged it." Greg's face flushed, his usual calm cracking. "Colonel, I think you're misunderstanding what happened here," he began defensively. "No, I understand perfectly," Daniel shot back, his eyes narrowing. "You created an environment where fear and suspicion became normal. That's not leadership. That's cowardice." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Greg opened his mouth as if to respond, but then closed it again, his face pale. Rachel felt her chest tighten, the truth in Daniel's words cutting through her as well. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint clinking of silverware from a far corner of the diner. Finally, Daniel turned toward the customers, his gaze sweeping the room. "Amelia Collins carried the weight of war on her shoulders," he said, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. "She fought for the freedoms you all enjoy every day, and yet, when she walked in here, she was treated like an outsider, like she didn't belong." Rachel felt her face burn with shame, her hands gripping the counter tightly. Jack, standing nearby, nodded faintly, his expression unreadable. Daniel looked back at Greg. "You owe her more than an apology. You owe her accountability. You owe her change." Greg swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the customers who were now watching him expectantly. He cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile. "Of course, Colonel. We'll address this appropriately." Daniel's gaze lingered on Greg for a moment before he turned and walked toward the door. He paused, glancing back at Rachel. For the first time, his expression softened. "Sometimes it takes one mistake to wake us up," he said quietly. "I hope you're awake now." Rachel nodded, her throat tight. "I am," she whispered. With that, Daniel stepped outside, the bell above the door chiming softly as it closed behind him. The diner remained silent for a long moment. Greg's shoulders slumped slightly as he turned back toward the kitchen, his usual confidence shaken. Customers began whispering again, their voices low but unmistakably critical. Rachel could feel their stares, their judgment hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Jack moved closer to Rachel, his voice low. "Well, kid, It looks like the Colonel did what needed to be done. Rachel let out a shaky breath, her chest aching. I guess so. Jack studied her for a moment, then gave her a small, encouraging nod. The question now is, what are you going to do about it? Rachel glanced at the door where Daniel had exited, his words still echoing in her head. She knew he was right. Change did not just happen. Someone had to start it. And now, that someone had to be her. As Rachel turned back to her work, her hands steadying for the first time in days, she realized something important. Mistakes did not have to define you. What mattered was what you did next. Rachel stood at the counter, her hands gripping the edge tightly as the hum of the diner swirled around her. Though customers had returned to their meals and small conversations, the weight of Colonel Brooks' words lingered like a shadow over Sunrise Diner. Rachel couldn't shake the way his voice had cut through the room, exposing the truth she had tried not to face her actions, Greg's silence, and the culture they had allowed to fester. Jack worked quietly nearby, pouring coffee for a pair of elderly women in the corner booth. He glanced at Rachel now and then, but said nothing. He did not need to. Rachel knew what he was thinking. It's time to act. Greg, however, had chosen a different response. After Daniel left, Greg retreated into the kitchen, emerging only occasionally to check on things. His face was a mask of forced calm, but Rachel could see the cracks forming. The Colonel's words had rattled him, though he refused to admit it. It was late afternoon when Greg finally spoke. "Staff meeting, now!" he barked as he stepped out of the kitchen. His voice was clipped, his frustration barely concealed. Rachel and Jack exchanged a glance before following him to the back of the diner, where a narrow hallway led to a small storage room. Greg stood with his arms crossed, pacing slightly as Rachel, Jack, and two other servers gathered around. The room smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and stale bread, the fluorescent light above them flickering faintly. "All right," Greg began, his voice sharp. "We need to put this situation behind us." Jack frowned, leaning against a stack of boxes. "Behind us?" he repeated, his voice carrying an edge. Greg shot him a look. "Yes, behind us. We can't afford another public embarrassment like that. Customers talk, word spreads, and this diner can't take another hit." Rachel flinched at his words. He was talking about the incident, but not once had he said Amelia's name. To Greg, the problem was not what had happened to her. The problem was the diner's image. "What are we going to do about it then?" Jack asked, his arms crossed. Greg stopped pacing and turned to the group. "We need to make it clear that we're taking this seriously. From now on, we'll handle situations more carefully." "Rachel," he said, his gaze snapping to her, "you'll need to be extra attentive to customers. Smile more. Keep things light. Show people we're fine. This," he gestured vaguely with his hand, "was a misunderstanding." Rachel's stomach turned. A misunderstanding? Is that what he was calling it now? Amelia's quiet shame, the Colonel's anger, the guilt that had weighed on her like an anchor, it was not a misunderstanding. It was a failure. "This isn't about smiling more, Greg," Rachel said suddenly, her voice steady despite the nerves rising in her chest. Greg's head snapped toward her. "Excuse me?" Rachel swallowed hard but held her ground. "This isn't about pretending everything's fine. It's not fine. What happened to Amelia? I was wrong. We were wrong. And if we don't do something real to fix it, people will see right through us." The room fell silent. Jack watched her closely, his expression unreadable. The other two servers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances but saying nothing. Greg's face darkened. "Rachel, I'm not asking for your opinion." "Well, maybe you should," Jack interjected, his voice calm but firm. "The kid's right. This isn't something we can sweep under the rug." Greg let out an incredulous laugh. "Sweep it under the rug? You think I'm trying to ignore this?" "Yes," Rachel said softly. "That's exactly what you're doing." Greg turned to her, his expression hardening. "You made the call that day, Rachel. You're the one who started this." The words struck her like a slap, but she refused to back down. "I did," she admitted, her voice clear and unwavering. "And I'll carry that. But you told us to be suspicious, Greg. You told us to act quickly, to not let anything slide. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now I wasn't, and neither were you." The silence that followed was heavy. Greg's jaw tightened. But for the first time, Rachel saw hesitation in his eyes, like a man cornered by a truth he could no longer deny. Jack straightened, his voice low but steady. "If we don't own up to this, it's going to keep happening. You think people haven't noticed? They have. And they're waiting to see if we'll do the right thing." Greg's shoulders slumped slightly, though he tried to hide it. "What do you propose we do?" he muttered, his voice bitter. Rachel took a deep breath, the words forming clearly in her mind. "We need to apologize. Not just a quick statement, but a real apology. And we need to change how we treat people. We need training. Greg, real training, so that no one else feels the way Amelia felt." Greg stared at her, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "Training? Apologies? Do you have any idea how much work that'll be? How much it'll cost?" "What'll it cost if we do nothing?" Jack asked quietly. "We'll lose more than customers, Greg. We'll lose trust." Greg looked at the faces around him, Jack's calm resolve, Rachel's quiet determination, the hesitant but supportive nods from the other servers. Finally, he let out a long, heavy sigh and rubbed his temples. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll think about it." "That's not good enough," Rachel said, surprising even herself. "We need to act. Now." Greg shot her a sharp look, but this time it lacked real bite. For the first time, he looked like a man who realized he was losing control, not just of his staff, but of the reputation he valued so much. "I'll look into it," he said stiffly, "but this conversation is over. Get back to work." The group dispersed slowly, Rachel and Jack trailing behind the others. As they stepped back into the main dining area, Jack clapped a hand on Rachel's shoulder. "Not bad, kid," he said quietly. "Not bad at all." Rachel managed a small, tired smile. "It's a start," she said softly. That evening, after her shift ended, Rachel lingered at one of the empty booths. The diner had quieted, the last customers leaving, as the closed sign was flipped on the door. Jack had already left for the night, but Rachel stayed behind, her thoughts restless. She pulled out a notepad from her bag and began writing ideas for how the diner could change, how they could train the staff to recognize their biases, and how to treat every customer with respect. It was not about punishing anyone, she realized, but about creating a space where people like Amelia felt welcomed, not judged. By the time she stood to leave, Rachel felt lighter than she had in days. She knew it would take more than one meeting or a single apology to fix what had been broken. But she also knew that change started somewhere, and if no one else would step up, then she would. As Rachel walked home, the cool air brushing against her face, she thought about Amelia, her quiet strength, her words that had stayed with her. "It takes courage to admit you were wrong." Rachel understood that now. Change was not easy, but it was necessary. And for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. The next morning, Rachel arrived at Sunrise Diner earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, casting long streaks of light through the mist lingering in the streets of Portland. The diner sat quietly beneath the dim glow of its neon sign, waiting to come alive for the day. Rachel unlocked the door, stepping into the stillness she once found comforting, but now felt heavy with the weight of unfinished business. As she tied her apron and flipped on the coffee machine, she thought about the notepad filled with scribbled ideas in her bag. Change had always seemed like something other people-initiated leaders, activists, people braver than her. But now, she realized it was not about grandeur. It was about action, even if that action started small. The diner gradually came to life as Jack arrived first. Then the rest of the staff trickled in. Greg was the last to appear, his usual stern expression in place, but Rachel noticed the faint strain around his eyes. When the morning meeting began, Greg's tone was clipped, but different, more measured, more hesitant. "We're addressing what happened earlier this week," he announced, his voice carrying through the small break room. He avoided saying Amelia's name, but everyone knew what he meant. Rachel suggested some changes. The room fell silent. Jack, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, raised an eyebrow in quiet approval as he glanced at Rachel. Rachel stepped forward, her heart racing, but her voice steady. "We need to make this right," she said, her eyes scanning the group. "I know I messed up. I acted on assumptions instead of facts, and it hurt someone who didn't deserve it. But it's not just me. This diner we need to do better. That starts with understanding the way we treat people and the choices we make." No one spoke, but the room was listening. Rachel took a deep breath and held up her notepad. "We need training, real training. I did some research last night, and there are local programs that teach businesses about bias awareness and customer relations. I think we should start there." Greg frowned, clearly torn. "Rachel, this diner isn't exactly flush with cash for things like training programs." Jack, who had been silent until now, straightened up. "It's better to spend a little now than lose everything later," he said calmly. "You heard the Colonel? People are watching us. Customers want to see we're serious about fixing this." Greg hesitated, but the truth in Jack's words settled over the room. The other servers nodded slowly, and even Greg could not deny the ripple effect of Amelia's story. Finally, he sighed. "I'll look into the programs you found," he muttered. Rachel felt a flicker of relief, but knew this was only the beginning. "Thank you," she said quietly, stepping back. Later that day, as the lunchtime rush died down, Rachel noticed a group of veterans seated near the back corner booth. They were older men and women, dressed in simple clothes, their hands curled around mugs of coffee as they spoke in low, familiar tones. Rachel recognized one of them, Colonel Daniel Brooks. Her stomach tightened at the sight of him. She could not tell if he had come to check on the diner or if this was just a coincidence, but either way, she knew she could not avoid him. Squaring her shoulders, Rachel grabbed a fresh pot of coffee and made her way toward their table. "More coffee?" she asked softly, her voice careful and polite. The veterans looked up, and Daniel's sharp gaze fixed on her. He nodded faintly. "Sure, thank you." Rachel poured the coffee, her hands steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her. She lingered for a moment, debating whether to speak, but the words pushed their way out before she could stop them. "Colonel Brooks," she said quietly. He looked up, one brow raised in curiosity. "Yes? I just wanted to say—" Rachel hesitated, but then met his gaze. "Thank you for speaking up. You were right about what happened here, and I'm trying to help fix it." Daniel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Good," he said simply. "Admitting there's a problem is the first step. Fixing it takes work. Do you understand that?" Rachel nodded. "I do. I'm not going to stop until we get it right." Daniel's face softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "Then keep at it. People like Amelia deserve better. We all do." Rachel let out a small breath, feeling as though she had passed an unspoken test. She turned to leave, but Daniel's voice stopped her. "Tell me something," he said. "Have you seen Amelia again?" Rachel paused, shaking her head. "No, I haven't. I wrote her a letter, but I'm not sure she'll come back." Daniel's gaze lingered on her for a moment. Then he glanced at his companions and said softly, "Sometimes people need time, but they also need to know you're serious. Keep doing the work. She'll see it eventually." Rachel nodded, his words sinking in as she returned to the counter. The weeks that followed were marked by quiet, steady progress. Greg, though reluctant at first, began implementing changes Rachel had suggested. He contacted a local nonprofit that specialized in bias awareness and customer relations. The training sessions were scheduled for the following month, and Greg announced that attendance would be mandatory for all staff, himself included. Jack, meanwhile, became an unexpected ally. During shifts, he helped Rachel explain to the rest of the team why the changes mattered. "It's not about pointing fingers," he said one afternoon as the servers gathered in the break room. "It's about making sure everyone who walks through those doors feels like they belong." The other servers gradually warmed to the idea. Some were hesitant, unsure of what training would involve, but Rachel noticed small shifts, a server smiling more at customers they might have once ignored, or someone stepping in to defuse a tense moment before it spiraled. The diner felt different, as though the air inside had lightened. Rachel, for her part, found herself changing in ways she had not expected. She began volunteering at the local Veterans Center on her days off, helping serve meals and listening to the stories of people like Amelia, stories of sacrifice, loss, and resilience. It opened her eyes to a world she had once overlooked. One afternoon, as Rachel wiped down a booth near the window, she spotted something that made her heart skip a beat. Amelia. She was standing outside the diner, her familiar travel bag slung over her shoulder. She stared through the window, her expression unreadable, as though debating whether to come inside. Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. Then, slowly, Amelia pushed open the door, the soft chime of the bell ringing through the quiet diner. Every head turned toward her, but this time there was no suspicion, no unease, only quiet recognition. Jack straightened from his spot at the counter, a faint smile playing on his lips. Rachel stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "Welcome back," she said. Amelia paused, her dark eyes meeting Rachel's. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly, and moved toward a booth by the window. Rachel swallowed hard, her chest tightening with something that felt like relief, like hope. She grabbed a clean menu and a fresh pot of coffee, her hands steady as she approached Amelia's table. "Can I get you started with some coffee?" Rachel asked, her voice warm. Amelia looked up at her, the faintest hint of a smile crossing her lips. "Yes, please," she said. Rachel poured the coffee, the steam rising into the space between them. It felt like something fragile, like something new. Amelia settled into her seat, glancing out the window as sunlight streamed in, casting golden lines across the table. For the first time in a long while, Sunrise Diner felt like what it was always meant to be, a place where everyone belonged. The air inside Sunrise Diner felt different, as though something unspoken had shifted when Amelia stepped through the door. The quiet hum of voices gradually returned, but the tension, the wariness that had once clung to the room was gone. It was as though her presence reminded the diner, its staff, and its customers of something important, that everyone carries a story. Amelia sat at her booth by the window, the same seat she had chosen weeks earlier when everything had unraveled. She stirred her coffee absently, staring out at the street as sunlight stretched across the glass. The faint clinking of plates and soft footsteps filled the space around her, but for once, she did not feel like an outsider. Rachel watched Amelia carefully from behind the counter. She had poured Amelia's coffee, delivered her menu, and offered a quiet smile, nothing more, nothing less. It had been enough. She did not hover nervously or ask unnecessary questions. Instead, she worked the floor naturally, her shoulders lighter than they had been in weeks. "Looks like she's giving us another chance," Jack said quietly as he wiped down a stack of coffee mugs. He glanced at Rachel, his expression thoughtful. "You handled that well." Rachel exhaled slowly, a small smile pulling at her lips. "It's what she deserves. I'm just glad she's here." Jack nodded faintly. "Sometimes people need to see change before they trust it." He leaned closer, his voice softer. "Keep at it, kid. You're doing the work." Rachel nodded. his words sitting with her as she moved to clear a nearby table. Amelia, meanwhile, remained in her booth, sipping her coffee in slow, deliberate motions. She noticed the subtle differences, the way the staff treated her like any other customer, the way no one's gaze lingered on her bag, the way the diner itself seemed more open somehow. She had not come expecting much, but as she sat there, she felt something she had not felt in a long time: belonging. It was late afternoon when the doorbell chimed again, drawing curious glances from the handful of customers still lingering. Colonel Daniel Brooks entered, his sturdy frame filling the doorway just as it had before. He paused, scanning the room, his gaze eventually settling on Amelia. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he approached her table. "Amelia," he said warmly, "I thought I might find you here." Amelia looked up, her lips curling faintly. "Colonel," she replied, "still checking up on me?" "Something like that," he said, sliding into the seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. He gestured toward the window. "It's a beautiful day out there. You sure you want to spend it in here?" "I like it here," Amelia said simply, taking another sip of coffee. Rachel, watching from the counter, felt her pulse quicken. Her instinct told her to check in with Amelia's table, but she resisted. She would not interrupt. Not now. Colonel Brooks leaned back in the booth, his sharp gaze studying Amelia. "Word around town is you stirred up a hornet's nest here," he said lightly. Amelia gave him a look, one brow raised. "I didn't stir anything. I just sat down for breakfast." The colonel chuckled, shaking his head. "You've always been like that. You walk into a room and force people to take a hard look at themselves." He paused, his voice softening. "That's not a bad thing, Amelia." She set her coffee cup down carefully, her gaze drifting to the window once again. "I didn't come back here looking to make trouble. I only wanted a little peace." "You deserve that," he said gently. "But sometimes the peace comes after the trouble, not before it." Amelia turned to look at him, her dark eyes steady. "Is that why you're here? To give me another speech?" "No," the colonel said with a faint smile. "I'm here because you reminded me and a lot of other people that we've still got work to do. You didn't ask for it, but you've become an example. People are listening now, and they need to hear what you have to say." Amelia frowned slightly. "Oh, what are you talking about?" The colonel leaned forward, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. "There's a community gathering next week, a veterans event downtown. A few people are speaking, sharing their stories. The organizers asked me to come, and I thought, you might want to as well." Amelia's face hardened. "I'm not interested in standing in front of a crowd." "I figured you'd say that," the colonel replied, unfazed. "But Amelia, your story matters. People need to see who you are, what you've done, not just because you're a veteran, but because you're you. Strong, resilient, unapologetic." Amelia looked down at her coffee, the steam long gone. "What's the point?" she murmured. "People don't change." The colonel's face grew serious, his tone low but firm. "They do if you give them a reason to." He gestured subtly toward the counter, where Rachel was wiping down tables, her movements deliberate, her posture no longer weighed down by guilt. "That girl over there, you changed her. You didn't mean to, but you did, and that's just one person. Think of how many others might listen if you gave them the chance." Amelia remained quiet, her thoughts a swirl of emotions she rarely let surface. She had spent years keeping to herself, carrying the memories of her comrades in silence. They were hers alone, she had always believed. But now it felt as though their memory had grown larger, spilling into the lives of people she never expected to reach. The colonel stood, his voice soft as he spoke one last time. "Just think about it. That's all I ask." Amelia nodded faintly, her gaze fixed on the scratched surface of the table. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. As the colonel left, Rachel finally approached Amelia's table. She moved cautiously, her heart beating a little faster. "How's the coffee?" she asked softly, her voice steady. Amelia looked up at her, and for a moment, Rachel thought she might not answer. But then Amelia's expression softened, the faintest hint of warmth in her eyes. "It's good," Amelia replied. "Thank you." Rachel hesitated, then took a small step closer. "I heard what the Colonel said," she admitted. "If you decide to speak at that event, I think it would mean a lot to people." Amelia studied Rachel for a long moment, as though weighing her sincerity. "And why does it matter to you?" Rachel swallowed hard. "Because people like me need to hear it," she said honestly. "We need to learn to do better. You've already taught me that, even if you didn't mean to." Amelia said nothing for a moment, but something in her gaze shifted a quiet understanding that passed between them. "I'll think about it," she said again, though this time her tone carried a little less hesitation. Rachel smiled faintly, her chest swelling with something she could not quite name. "I'm glad you came back," she said softly, before turning to leave Amelia to her coffee. As the afternoon light stretched through the diner's windows, Amelia sat quietly, her thoughts drifting to the past and present, to the faces she carried with her, and the small ripples she never intended to create. Maybe the Colonel was right. Maybe people could change if someone gave them a reason to. For the first time in a long while, Amelia considered sharing her story, not as a burden, but as a bridge, something that might help others see the world, and each other, a little differently. And as she sat there, sipping the last of her coffee, she thought, maybe it's time. The day of the community veterans event arrived with crisp blue skies and a quiet stillness in the air. Downtown Portland was alive with activity as people gathered at a modest but welcoming hall adorned with banners that read, "Honoring Those Who Served." Folding chairs were set up in neat rows facing a small stage where local veterans and community leaders were scheduled to speak. Amelia stood outside the hall, clutching her worn travel bag tightly. She had not planned on coming. For days she had wrestled with the Colonel's invitation, her mind a battlefield of doubt and hesitation. The idea of standing in front of strangers, of sharing parts of herself she had always kept hidden, unsettled her. But as she looked at the hall now, something pushed her forward. Maybe it was the Colonel's words. Maybe it was Rachel, that young waitress who had started as part of the problem but was now working so hard to be part of the solution. Or maybe it was something deeper, a quiet whisper from the faces she carried with her, those she had lost. With a sigh, Amelia adjusted the strap of her bag and climbed the steps, her boots clicking softly against the concrete. Inside, the room was already filling with people, veterans of all ages, some wearing their old military jackets. Others in simple, worn clothes like her sat among families, students, and members of the community. Amelia found a seat toward the back, setting her bag carefully on the floor beside her. She scanned the crowd quietly, taking in the faces young, old, curious, kind. No one paid her much attention, which was exactly how she wanted it. The hum of conversation died down as the event began. The Colonel took the stage first, his presence commanding as always. He spoke with quiet authority, his words steady and full of conviction. He shared stories of sacrifice, of resilience, and of the importance of understanding those who have served. As he spoke, Amelia's gaze drifted toward the side of the room where Rachel stood. She was not in her diner uniform, but a simple blouse and jeans, her expression nervous yet determined. When their eyes met, Rachel gave her a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement that made something in Amelia's chest ease just slightly. "Today, we are here to listen," the Colonel said, his voice carrying across the hall. "To honor those who served, not with empty words, but with understanding. And one person here today has a story that deserves to be heard." Amelia tensed as the Colonel turned toward her, his eyes steady. "Amelia Collins," he said gently. Would you join us? All eyes turned toward her. The room, once filled with quiet murmurs, fell completely silent. Amelia felt her pulse quicken. She had not agreed to this. She had only come to listen, to sit in the back and leave unnoticed. And yet, as the colonel looked at her, his expression patient and unwavering, she knew this was not something she could walk away from. Slowly, Amelia stood, her movements deliberate. The soft scrape of her chair against the floor sounded louder than it should have. She picked up her travel bag, clutching it tightly as she made her way to the front of the room. With each step, she felt the weight of the moment pressing against her shoulders. When she reached the podium, the room seemed impossibly still. She looked out at the faces staring back at her, strangers, neighbors, veterans, and Rachel, standing near the door, her expression hopeful and encouraging. Amelia took a deep breath, her hands trembling faintly against the wood of the podium. "I don't usually speak to crowds," she began softly, her voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who had seen more than most. "I'm not used to sharing my story because for a long time I didn't think it mattered." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the front row, where a group of older veterans sat watching her intently. "I served in the military for most of my younger years," she continued, her voice steadier now. "I joined because I wanted to protect something bigger than myself, my family, my community, my country. But what you don't realize when you sign up is what you'll lose along the way. Friends, time, pieces of yourself that you don't always get back." She paused again, her fingers brushing over the edge of her bag as she spoke. "There are people I served with, friends I loved like family, who never made it home, and I carry them with me every day. I carry them in this bag," she said, glancing down at it, "because this is where I keep their memory alive. A picture, their names, small things that remind me of who they were." The room remained silent, but Amelia could feel the shift in the air, the way people were listening, really listening, to her words. "I walked into a diner a few weeks ago," Amelia said, her voice quieter now but still clear. "I just wanted a meal and a moment of peace. Instead, I found suspicion, assumptions. I was treated like a problem, not a person." Rachel lowered her head slightly, shame flickering across her face. Amelia caught the movement but did not linger on it. "It hurt," Amelia continued. "Not because I was embarrassed, but because it reminded me of something I've carried with me for years. When people don't understand you, they're quick to make judgments. But we all carry something: loss, pain, memories, and none of us deserve to be defined by how we look or what others assume." Amelia's gaze softened as she scanned the room. "But that moment taught me something too. It showed me that people can change. They can learn, and they can do better. The young woman who served me that day, she's here now, and she's trying to make things right." Rachel looked up, her eyes wide with surprise and gratitude. "That's why I'm standing here," Amelia said firmly. "Not because I want attention, but because I want people to understand that kindness matters. Listening matters. Change is possible, but it starts with each of us. Treat people like they matter, because they do. We all have our own stories, and those stories deserve respect." Amelia let the words settle into the room, the quiet stretching as though the walls themselves were holding on to her message. Finally, she stepped back, her hands steady now, as she turned to leave the podium. The room erupted into applause, soft at first, then rising as people stood, clapping not out of politeness, but out of genuine admiration. Rachel wiped her eyes quickly, clapping along as Amelia made her way back to her seat. Colonel Brooks smiled faintly as Amelia sat down, his gaze full of pride. "You did good," he said softly. Amelia nodded, her lips curling into the smallest of smiles. "I hope so." The event ended with quiet conversations and handshakes, people lingering to thank the veterans who had spoken. Rachel approached Amelia just as she was preparing to leave, her heart pounding. "That was incredible," Rachel said softly. her voice full of sincerity. "Thank you for sharing that." Amelia looked at her, the lines in her face softening. "You're trying," she said simply. "That's what matters." Rachel smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "I'll keep trying, I promise." Amelia nodded, reaching for her bag. "Good. Just remember, change doesn't happen overnight." Rachel watched as Amelia walked toward the door, her posture strong, her travel bag slung over her shoulder. The weight she carried had not disappeared, but she no longer bore it alone. As Amelia stepped outside, the sunlight caught her face, and for the first time in years, she felt lighter. In the weeks that followed, Sunrise Diner transformed. Greg, after some initial resistance, embraced the changes Rachel and Jack had pushed for. Staff attended bias awareness training, and Greg himself spoke at team meetings about the importance of treating every customer with respect. Once a month, the diner began hosting Veterans Appreciation Breakfasts, offering free meals and a welcoming space for veterans in the community. Customers noticed the changes, and word spread. Slowly, trust returned to the diner. Rachel, now confident and composed, often served tables with Amelia's words in her heart. Treat people like they matter. And though Amelia only visited the diner once in a while, her story remained a quiet reminder of the power of resilience, understanding, and hope. Months passed, and Sunrise Diner became more than just a place for coffee and pancakes. It became a symbol of progress and understanding in the community. People talked about the diner as a place where mistakes had turned into lessons, where change had started not with a grand gesture, but with a willingness to listen and grow. Amelia, though she preferred her solitude, occasionally stopped by. She would sit by the window with her coffee and a quiet smile, unnoticed by most, but always welcomed with genuine warmth by the staff. Rachel, who had grown into a confident and compassionate young woman, made sure to serve Amelia personally whenever she came in. One evening, just as the diner was closing, Rachel stood near the counter, gazing out the window at the streetlights flickering to life. Jack leaned beside her, arms crossed, a faint smile on his face. "You did good, kid," he said softly. "The diner's better because of you." Rachel smiled, feeling the truth in his words. "We all did this," she replied. "Even Greg eventually." Jack chuckled. "True, but it started with you being brave enough to face your mistakes. That's not something everyone can do." Rachel thought of Amelia's quiet strength, her courage to share her story, and the way she had inspired change in ways she never intended. "Amelia showed me how," Rachel said. "We don't change unless we're willing to try." Jack nodded. "Keep at it. This place is better for it." Outside, the faint hum of cars drifted through the air as Rachel flipped the diner's sign to closed. She looked around the room, now empty, but alive with the echoes of lessons learned, connections made, and kindness shared. Change, she realized, did not happen all at once. It happened one step, one choice, one small act of kindness at a time. The story of Sunrise Diner and Amelia Collins is a reminder that kindness, understanding, and accountability can ripple out and change lives in ways we do not always see. We all carry stories of struggle, strength, and hope, and we all have the power to make the world a little better. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt and meaningful stories. Let's keep spreading messages of resilience, kindness, and hope, because small actions can create powerful change. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.